This week, the big story in college football was obviously the college football playoff will not expand until at least 2026. And to be honest with you, listening to the decision makers in the room, I don't have a ton of confidence right now about any expansion format. Now, I'm not going to rehash my feelings on this in the immediacy because you know what my feelings are. My stance on expansion is well established. I couldn't care less about it. I am anti-expansion. A lot of you disagree with me. We've gone over that. But I want to address that disagreement in just a couple of minutes, not in a debate format. Not really here to change your mind. If you're open to it, then we can talk on the side. I'm not here to do that. But here's what's kind of weird about the whole thing. For a long time, this past summer, I thought it was inevitable that expansion was imminent. Remember when they put out that proposal, that 12-team proposal, and it sounded like it was all but a formality. And you got to think, reasonable minds agreed that if they're going to allow an actual format to be out there, then they're well down the road. And it's just I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed, but this thing's inevitable, right? Well, it wasn't. But I was so convinced that expansion was imminent, I kind of stopped talking about it on the show. I was depressed. I was saddened. I was, dare I say, dismayed and disheartened. But I was going to roll with it and we were going to make the best out of it, but I didn't do many segments on it. So we got into the season and we talked about football because that's what we talk about during the season. And then you start hearing whispers that maybe it's not quite as decided as it looks like. And so I start getting a little confidence about myself, but I don't want to get worked up too much. But I'm asking, is really there anything anyone can do? I mean, even if this microphone has a lot of power behind it, is there really anything we can do? It's out of our hands at this point, but I started to wonder, what is the best tool to fashion to fight against expansion? And you know, it turns out the best weapon that we ever could have found to fight against playoff expansion was a pair of sunglasses and a lawn chair. All you had to do is sit out in your front yard. They were going to screw it up just fine on their own. And they did. Now, you think they screwed it up. I think what happened is beautiful. But I do want to just table that for a second, okay? Because there are a lot of folks who think expansion is integral to the overall health and wellness of the sport. There are people like me who completely laugh at that notion. It's okay to debate these sorts of things, okay? It's okay, but I want to ask you to join me in doing one thing tonight. And I am talking to you, the expansionist crowd, because I know we have a sizable portion of you even in our audience. I don't think you're bad people. I think you're good people that just happen to have a bad idea here. I hope you think of me the same way. We can debate all we want to. We can have whole shows worth of debate. I'm not really here to do that tonight. What I am here to do, though, is ask you, before we take another step further down the road of debating expansion or contraction or staying the same, can we just agree on one thing here? Can we agree that neither of us is really interested in the sweater vest bureaucrat crowd telling us what's best for the overall health of college football? Can we please agree that if the suit you're wearing costs more than what we make in an average week, and trust me when I say we, I get it, the sample department was a big part of my life. That fabric warehouse, local news was a huge chunk of my life. If you're wearing a suit that's worth more than we're making in a calendar week, can we please just agree that that crowd probably doesn't feel the same way we do when we talk about the overall health and what's best for college football? Can we agree with that? Because we're loyal to Saturday. They are loyal to a number, and that's it. And so what I'd really love for both of us to do is I'd love for us to be like, 2002, maybe, one Royal Rumble. It was Steve Austin and Triple H, and they're going at it. But every time a new participant entered, they put their disagreement on pause so they could eliminate another wrestler. That's kind of what I want us to do. It's fine. We can go at it, and we can put our knives away for a second, and we can watch the sweater vest crowd, the bow tie crowd, step to a podium when they haven't come to an agreement, talking about what is and isn't necessary for the overall health and wellness of college football. And we can just take the index finger and press it against the lips and say, shh. Go out in the hallway, go sit by the garbage, we've got this. Shut the door, and then we can get back to what we really disagree on, because our motivation is really the same. You and I, the expansionist crowd versus the 4 and no more crowd, 95% of us want the same thing. We just differ in how we best feel we can get there. That crowd out in the hallway, we can talk openly now that they're out of the room, they don't even start from the same premise we do. They're not loyal to Saturday. They're not loyal to Saturdays in the fall. That's not what they care about. They truly believe that it's a beautiful thing to watch college football teams go against each other in in lifeless NFL venues in January. They truly love that stuff. They love the corporate suites. They've never sat on metal bleachers before. These people have never painted their chest or their face. They couldn't care less about that stuff. They have a driver go fill their car so they don't even have to touch the same gas pump as you and I do. They don't care. So that crowd's in the hallway. I hope we could have agreed at least on that. Now, where you and I disagree fundamentally is not on whether we value Saturday. Of course we're loyal to Saturday. The folks who want expansion love Saturdays just as much as I do. I know that. I'm not ignorant enough to believe otherwise. There's a lot of common ground here. And the more I was thinking about it over the weekend, there's a lot more common ground between the crowd who wants to expand and the crowd like me who wants to either sit here or go backwards, back in time, than it ever appeared on the surface. We all value Saturdays. If I were to poll the expansionist crowd and ask them, do you love the regular season in college football? 95% of you would say yes, and the other 5 are just, that's the crowd who wouldn't agree with you that the sky's blue. Everyone loves it. Amongst us, everyone loves it because we're actual real college football fans. We're not loyal to anything other than really our interest in Saturday. And we also love the concept of a champion being crowned. Where we differ fundamentally is we differ in how much we think an expanded postseason would negatively impact the regular season, and then at a far more like elementary level, you and I disagree on how important the playoff should be, period. And so I was scrolling through Twitter the other day when this news broke, and it was a guy by the name of Greg Tepper who I thought summed it up beautifully. And in part, actually, you know what? I took a screenshot of the tweet. Listen to this, because this encapsulates exactly what we have talked about on this program for a long time. But in order to understand this, I don't need you to take one step back. If you're an expansionist, I will ask you to do this for me. Take 10 steps back. I mean back way away, where you can see everything. Don't go 10,000 feet, go 50,000 feet. Just hit the reset button for a second. Just humor me for a second. And I want you to think about this sport as if you just walked in the door. Here's what Greg Tepper said. He said, what makes college football fun is the depth of storylines and the unique journey each team takes, but we've been conditioned to believe in this sport, if you're not first, you're last. I have found that to be a pretty unfulfilling way to consume the sport. Especially, here's where I really want you to pay attention, especially in a clearly inequitable sport with a handful of obvious haves and have-nots, worrying about which guy is the most handsome doesn't seem all that interesting. And then I'm going to add at the end, when the guys don't have the same thing to work with to begin with. In life, we call that genetics. In college football, we call that resource. What has bothered me, and again, we're taking 10 steps back here. You know, if you've watched the show for a long time now, what's bothered me at the core is the concept of applying Sunday principles to the Saturday game. I never push back against the NFL. I never rail against their postseason format. They can make that thing as big as they want. They can take 20 teams for all I care. I've never pushed against it because it makes sense to have an expanded postseason in the pro game. Because everything about the pro game is built on the foundation of an equitable approach. In other words, it's meant to be a vice. It's meant to punish you the more successful you are and push everything to the middle to where on any given Sunday, it's why one of the most successful football movies ever had that name attached to it. On any given Sunday, anything can happen. That's never been the case in college football. Quite literally, regardless of what the statistics crowd tells you, if I put Miami of Ohio on the same field as Alabama, you're getting the same result a million times out of a million. To pretend that 130 teams play the same sport is laughable. It's always been laughable to me, but there's nothing wrong with the actual structure of the game. What's wrong, as Greg Tepper very, very astutely pointed out, is to pretend that if you're not in playoff contention, which realistically like 5 or 10% of the sport has any chance to ever be, that you're a failure, that you're last, and that you should be disappointed in your outcome. That's the part that's laughable. The reason I asked you to take 10 steps back instead of just look at it from a different angle is because you need to go back a little ways. And if you're 19, 22 years old, we got a huge college audience. You guys really don't remember a time wherein this sport did not revolve around the playoff. You grew up in the who's in era, as we like to call it. I will credit ESPN for dropping that this past year as part of their marketing campaign. Damage done, but credit the four-letter network at the very least for dropping that as part of the college football marketing campaign. But you grew up in the who's in era. And so I understand that everything about your perception of this sport has who's in baked into it. Like the playoff is the center of your college football universe. But when you take 10 steps back, you can think of a time, some of you lived through it, most of you lived through it, some of the younger crowd hasn't, but think of a world where the playoff is there, the national championship is there, but it's not even remotely what the sport revolves around. If you're Oregon State and Vegas has the over-under at 4.5 for total wins, and you're going into that last week in November against Oregon, and you've already won 7 games, and you're on the precipice of winning 8 games and doubling your preseason win total, it means the entire world to you. And there used to be a time not too long ago where that's all that mattered. That Saturday in the fall, that's all that mattered. And you were about to throw a ticker tape parade in Corvallis, Oregon, even though you lost 4 games. Why? Because your expectation level was properly calibrated. It wasn't attached to this foolish notion of who's in. There was a world where we had a national championship, but Saturdays in the fall, that's what the sport revolved around. And then a crowd came in and they said, you can keep all that and also have this big playoff apparatus attached to the end of that season. You've already seen what 4 teams worth of a playoff has done to that concept. I think it's very foolish, and those of us in my camp think it's very foolish to assume that more of what caused the initial problem will solve the problem. Now that, at its very, very core, has been my approach to this. But I want to follow it up with this idea. Whether you like it or not at the moment, we've got what we've got for the next few years. So I would encourage you, since you can't do anything to change it, you're as powerless as I am to change it, I would encourage you, at the very least, over the next few seasons, to approach college football and your own viewing experience and your rooting experience with the mentality that Saturdays in the fall are what are totally unique to this sport. The regular season being crystallized is what's totally unique to this sport. It doesn't always have to work off the premise of the fact that we're building towards something at the end, and if we're not involved in that, then this in the present doesn't really mean as much. It doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to be that way at all. When I did radio hits last week, and people were asking me, what's your ideal format? They were thinking I was either going to say 4, 8, or 12, and I told them 2. I'd love to go back because I think the sport was a lot healthier when we lived in a time and period where there were 2 teams, but look, folks were jacked to play in the Gator Bowl. Folks were jacked to play New Year's Day in Florida or play out in the Rose Bowl. Doesn't matter if there's a national championship attached to it. There are going to be a couple of teams out there, and this is still the case and always will be the case, no matter what your postseason structure is, that are way better than everyone else. Some years it's 1, some years it's 4, but that crowd can go play for a national championship. I'll watch it, you'll watch it, we'll all enjoy it. It'll do a huge number. We don't have to delude the rest of what is most valuable in this sport, that being the regular season, in chasing unicorns. And the unicorn, in this sense, is competitive balance and parity and evening out the recruiting landscape. It's never happening. It's not going to happen. Here's the unfortunate part and why people like me get a little worked up about it. I speak in such absolutes because I know it's not going to happen. I mean, I'm as certain about that as I am the sun coming up tomorrow. That's not the debate in my mind. What debate in my mind is what do we do when we get there and the rest of these folks realize this was fool's gold? And we just enriched a lot of the bow tie sweater vest crowd who told us this is what's best for college football, and then you come to that realization. Wait a second. It turns out what's best for college football actually meant what's best for them. And I'm looking around and I don't like what the sport is now, but then you look behind you and guess what you don't see? You don't see a bridge. It's out. The bridge is burned. You can't go back. And then folks like me who never wanted to cross it to begin with are looking around and you can't even say, I told you so, because even that's pointless when you get to that point. So that is my general take on why I don't want expansion. It's also understandable, even though I disagree with it, when you guys come to me and you think to yourself and you tell me you love the regular season, our approach would give you more to love in the regular season because there would be more games with playoff implications riding on them. The second part of your sentence is true. The first part is not. You're assuming that the value of that playoff is always the same. You're assuming that the value of one of those playoff spots always will mean what it means right now. And it won't. You cannot decrease the scarcity of those spots and maintain the value of them. You can't. It'll take a few years once we get into that, so we may be talking about like 2030 by the time this happens, but there'll come a day where those playoff spots don't even mean as much. And then all of a sudden you got a huge problem on your hands, and I'm not going down this road tonight, but once upon a time, not too long ago, like a decade ago, it would have been ludicrous to ever assume that any player was going to entertain the idea of opting out of a New Year's Six caliber bowl game. Now it's regular. And so I would say right now, it's totally ludicrous to ever assume that a player would consider opting out of a playoff game. And for right now, it is ludicrous. And for a while, in an expanded playoff, it'd be ludicrous. But there would come a time where your expectations about how the playoff plays out would be recalibrated. And there would also come a time where your value that you place on playoff spots would recalibrate. And then you would be in the new college football world. And once it became known in everyone's mind that those playoff spots aren't really worth what they used to be worth, and these teams get blown out every playoff anyway, once we got to that point, and you had a kid with millions of dollars on the line, and all of a sudden we've come to expect that 9 seed's going to get run, that 11 seed's going to get run, it happens every year, all of a sudden, all it has to do is happen once. Have the phrase meaningless playoff game floated out there, and have the concept of a playoff opt-out floating out there, and it is wildfire. It takes off, and it's there to stay. And you look back again, you say, how do we get rid of this? What do we do? There is nothing. It's like westward expansion. If you don't like New York, you can move to Missouri. You don't like Missouri, might I suggest the Rockies? You don't like the Rockies, check out San Francisco. You can't move any further west. And so once you get to that fabled kind of 12-team utopia of a playoff expansion that everyone, or a lot of people at least, think is the answer to all of college football's problems, and it doesn't work out, you have nowhere else to go, and you can't go back either. So humbly, calmly as I can, that's my take on that and why I kind of get worked up about it sometimes. So I'll see you in 2022 and 3 and 4 and 5, and we'll see what happens down the road.